I know there's a machine at the end of this wire. Let me remind you again, as we talked about at the beginning, John is a little bit different gospel than the other three. They being more historical and detail-oriented, talking about the sequence of events and things like that. John being more of a relationship with Jesus. It's meant to increase our faith and our understanding and our oneness with Jesus. And so, having said that, I'm going to read a piece of John 20. And this is centered around the events of the resurrection. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Peter and the other disciples started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped down, looked in, and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter arrived, and he went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in. He saw and believed, for until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. Okay, here's the thing. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she stooped down and looked inside. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken my Lord, and I don't know where they have put him." She turned to leave, and she saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she did not recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought that he was the gardener. She says, "Sir, if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. So she didn't recognize him, and then she recognized him when he called her name with his voice. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." And then she gave them Jesus' message. I think it's quite a story that Mary Magdalene is there. Mary Magdalene, what are some key things that we remember about Mary Magdalene really quick? Anything that comes to mind? Mary Magdalene was at one time possessed by demons. And Jesus healed her. 7 demons coming out. After that, she proceeded with the disciples along their travels, and likely, along with some of the other women, helped provide logistics or whatever for their daily walks and their travels. I think it's quite ironic in the cultural period of that time where men counted and women didn't, that she had such a presence with Jesus, that she was so important that he chose her to be the one that he first saw after he rose. And he blessed her for all of eternity with that gift, that she was the first, and that she was so excited that she then ran to the disciples to tell them, as their brains were just starting to click on what this was all about. So here's a question for you. In the time that Jesus spent after he rose again, what was the motive? What was the reason? Okay, if I were going to write this story, I would have him hanging on the cross. I would have him get to the point that he's going to die. His head would flop over, and then immediately his body would step out of the other body, radianced in bright light, and there would be earth shaking and thunderclaps and everybody in awe, and he would step off the cross, and then he would ascend to heaven in a fiery chariot. I mean, you could see him from 3 countries over, okay? That's right, that'd be the Hollywood version. But that's not what he did. So what was his purpose?
We have a Persian daughter in Christ. My husband baptized her in 2003. And when we were gathered for a feast at her house one time, one of the Persian men spoke up and said, "A folded napkin means you're returning. When you go out to eat, if you fold a napkin, that means you're coming back."
Right.
And if you're doing the meal, you just let it up and leave it. You're not coming back.
That was a clear message for them that this is not over. Okay? So what would be the things that Jesus would do? He had walked for 3 years with his disciples, teaching them and getting them prepared to disseminate across the entire world the good news and the message of Jesus. And his so he's about to launch that whole effort. You know, so you had the 3 years of teaching, now is the launch. All right, he's going to see that whole effort cast across the world. What are anything else you can think of that would be important for Jesus to do during this period of time? And of course, I don't know that the disciples really knew that this was going to be the way it was, or that it was going to last a very short time, relatively. I'm not sure that they, things weren't clicking in their head until after the fact. But what would be the things that Jesus would want to look after? He'd want to ensure that the base is there for the launch. He'd want to make sure that everybody was aligned, everybody knew their parts, everybody was charged up, everybody was ready to go.
I think possibly one of the things he needed to give them a little bit of time to grieve. If he had, your scenario, it would have been what maybe they would have expected or something. But then the reality that it was on the first day of the week that he rose, they might have just still been in their same life of the Sabbath and everything. This is the new covenant. Now it's the first day of the week. It's not what they have always known before.
Things are different.
I think his confrontation, if you want to call it that, with Thomas, who didn't believe till the last minute, and also later on at the end, his interaction with Peter about, do you love me?
Right.
Those are things he was kind of setting straight, weren't they? On an individual level, maybe.
That, in fact, is what the last half of this class is about his interaction with Peter. And we're going to launch into that in just a moment. But certainly, he was increasing their faith and their belief. He was girding them for the battle ahead, for the trip ahead, for the task ahead. And he's about to see this whole thing take off. So it's a monumental pinnacle to all this building that's been going on for eons, but particularly in the last 3 years. So with that, let's launch into this interaction that we have with Peter. And look at the details of that from the perspective of what do we do after Jesus' rise? What is our part of it? What is Peter's part of it? What are we asked to do? How are we asked to act? How does it apply to us today? So let's kick into this.
The cross in our world has often become a piece of ornamentation or jewelry for Christians. Some crosses are even made to look beautiful. But the cross upon which Christ died was a wooden cross like the one over my shoulder. There was nothing beautiful about it. It was an instrument of execution, and cruel, torturous execution at that. But it became the Christian symbol. And Jesus had an unusual way of talking about the cross. The word he uses is glory. Of all things, the cross would be the place where Jesus would be glorified. What would it mean to look at the cross and not see a piece of jewelry, and not just see an execution instrument, but instead to see the glory of God? When John talks about the trial and crucifixion of Jesus, he does it in ways that are very different from the other Gospels. And there's one theme that comes through over and over and over again. And that theme is this: no one does anything to Jesus that he doesn't want to happen. Jesus is absolutely, totally, 100% in control of the situation. I want to show you just a few passages from the trial and crucifixion of Jesus to illustrate this. First of all, in John chapter 18, when Jesus is arrested. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches and lanterns and weapons. We call that the Frankenstein verse of the Bible: torches and lanterns and weapons. That's what you go to get Frankenstein with. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, oh, did you hear that? Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Let us pause. Okay, our English translations really make a muck of this. They come out to arrest Jesus. They have all their weapons and stuff, and they come to get him, and Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus' response is two words in Greek: A go, a me. I am. Who are you seeking? Jesus of Nazareth. I am, he says. And they all fall down. And knowing our Bible as we do, that immediately reminds us of another story. Of a story about I am and a man falling down. It's like Moses in the burning bush all over again. It's as if Jesus is kind of winking at us and nodding and saying, okay, you know, God, me. And the people who came out to arrest him all fall down. And it doesn't say this in the text, that what happens next is Jesus says, well, come on, this is embarrassing. I can't arrest myself. Come on. Let's go. We got work to do here. He wants to make it clear, you know, nobody's taking Jesus against his will. He's in control. In Jesus' arrest and trial, Pilate is really bothered by Jesus in the book of John. He's troubled by the whole conversations. Jesus kind of turns him inside out. Pilate really wants to let him go, but he's afraid of the Jewish leaders who can, you know, kind of create all sorts of problems for him. And at one point, he says to Jesus, don't you get this? I have the power to let you go or to have you killed. To which Jesus' response is, power? Any power that you have comes from above, where I come from. You don't have any power. John wants to make sure that we know that not only can they not arrest Jesus, they can't crucify him unless he wants it to happen. And so then we have the actual story of the crucifixion. It's in John 19, verse 16. Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross, because he could do that in John. He's the Son of God. Cross, no problem. He went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. How's that make you feel? You wouldn't be able to read it in 3 languages. The chief priest of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I've written, I've written. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled, which said, they divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. Why did they gamble for Jesus' clothes? Because it was in the prophecy and it had to be done. So this is what the soldiers did. Not because they decided to, because it was in the prophecy. It had to be done. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, Mother, here is your son, and to the disciple, here is your mother. From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. What is Jesus doing while he's on the cross? He's doing domestic relations. Mary, son, mother. Doesn't look like a suffering Jesus. It looks like somebody who's pretty much in control of the world. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that Scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. Okay, that one's easy to miss. Jesus says, I am thirsty, not because he's thirsty. John would never say that. Jesus says, I am thirsty so that the Scripture will be fulfilled. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. It's really interesting that in the book of John, Jesus doesn't really get killed. He decides. And it's almost as if he's going down his checklist. Okay, let's see. Crucifixion. What do we got here? Gamble for my clothes. Okay, done. John, Mary. Done. Okay, we're done. No, I forgot. I'm thirsty. Okay. Done. I'm out of here. And with that, Jesus gives up his spirit. It's an absolutely different way to tell the story. It's one of the glorious things about the Gospels is they give us these very different views of what's going on here. And from John's point of view, the one thing he wants these Christians he's writing to understand is this. Jesus died the shameful death of the cross because Jesus decided to. Nobody kills Jesus. Nobody arrests Jesus. Nobody tries and beats Jesus without his permission. That's what John wants you to understand. And that what Jesus is basically doing here is he is telling this story with his life. And he's saying, when you look at this, you just shouldn't see cross, you should see glory. This is the fulfillment of what God intended for the Word become flesh. Jesus is going to show us how to do it. Okay, now, I got to really be careful here, so I want you to really listen close to this. There is nothing sadder in the world than people using their power over other people to do bad things. And there is nothing more glorious when those who have the power lay it down for the sake of people who don't have any. And that's the story that John wants to tell. Jesus, who has all the power in the world, who with a word, I am, can fell the soldiers who come to arrest him, decides that he will die for you. So when John tells the story of the resurrection, we're not surprised because Jesus has been in control of this story all the way. We know how it's going to end because nobody could take the life of the Logos and expect him to stay dead. We're not surprised because Jesus raised Lazarus, and we know he has the power of life and death. With all the power in the world, Jesus says, I am the one who is lunch meat, washes the disciples' feet, and lay down my life. This is my glory. And this is John's gospel. This is the good news that John has to share. John thinks of Jesus much less as a victim when he looks at the cross, and much more as the righteous martyr. Nothing happens to Jesus without his permission. And so it's not so much that Jesus was killed as that Jesus laid down his life. The cross is not something that just happened to him. The cross is what Jesus embraces as his fundamental identity, his fundamental glory.
You ever known anybody in spiritual crisis, up close and personal? Ever been there yourself? I dare say that for a crowd with this much maturity, we've been there. We've seen it, or we've been it, we've owned it. It happens. And this is a beautiful story of Jesus restoring one that was really so dear to him, Peter. And when did it fall apart for Peter?
When he denied him.
Jesus was arrested and he denied him. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Why 3 times? 3 times is completeness. He denied him completely. And then he ran. Now, 3 years of training, walking shoulder to shoulder with Jesus, seeing all that Jesus had and all the miracles, all the training, and he denies and runs. So how does Peter feel about himself?
Well, it's not just the denial, it's the fact that Jesus predicted the denial. And he said, no, not me.
Right.
And you will, for truth.
Which just multiplied the anguish more, right? Absolutely. So living with the prediction and then it coming true. Could you get any lower than where Peter is? So what does Peter do? He goes fishing.
First off, he goes back to his old ways. He goes back fishing, figures
Right.
it's done, it's over with.
Right. He goes back to where he began because his whole life has been turned askew. He's upside down and backwards. So he goes back to where he was at the beginning. He goes back fishing. And so what does Jesus do in the classical manner of how Jesus has relations with other people? Jesus goes to him. And he meets him where he is. Click, 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 click. That's a lesson right there. Go to where they are. Meet them where they are. And then he has breakfast. He makes breakfast for him. But he calls him from the boat. He says, come, have breakfast. And then while Peter is there, he asks him a simple question. Do you love me? And from what I can understand, if I read between the lines, I don't see Peter actually answering the first time. I think he's so conflicted that he's not even able to answer. And then Jesus asked him a second time, do you love me? By now he's starting to come around. But he asked him, do you love me, with one level of love? And he says, yes, I love you with another level of love, less. A different level, if not in gravity, at least in a different love. But you also notice that Jesus says, if you love me, feed my sheep. Now, what's the feed my sheep part in there for? What is that? Why did he say that part? I could understand, do you love me? But why did he say, feed my sheep?
You still have a job to do.
Bingo. That's it. You still have a job to do. You have a task. Jesus is very gently realigning him with his task. Do you love me? Then here's your task. Okay, for reinforcement, a second time. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. By now, maybe Peter is starting to figure out where this is going. Or maybe the burden is being lifted off of his body. Either way, the answer is the same. By the time you get down to the third one, do you love me? He's taking Peter out of the depths and raising him back up. And now he's back face to face with Jesus. So I ask a question. Have you ever been there? When I was studying this just came flooding into my mind. And, you know, I have a lot of things I'm not proud about in my life. We all do, I'm sure. At least I do. We had not been married too long. I don't know, maybe a few years, because I remember where we lived at that time. But I had become disillusioned and I quit going to church. I met her at church. Church was our foundation. It was our point, okay? And we had probably one baby, perhaps. And I just quit going to church. Now, Jolene kept going to church, being the beautiful soul that she is. And apparently, I got missed. And she had a conversation with a particular person. And that guy says, I think we'll just go visit him. I did not know this was coming. It's a good thing, or I would have been fishing. And Jesus would have had to come to me. Okay, I'm going there. So one day a car pulls up, and I've got nowhere to run. And these two guys get out. I recognize, I think probably both of them, but for sure one. And it was Sam. And I don't recall the other guy. And the purpose of Sam was to pick me up, to make sure we had common ground, and then to realign me. And he did a beautiful job. And I remember very little about all of it, other than I was totally aghast that somebody would come visit me, not in a good way. And, you know, it's almost like your mother coming out with a switch, you know, something bad's about to happen. But Sam, in a beautiful, beautiful way, he basically got down to the point and asked me, did I love Jesus? Did I still love God? And even in my distress, I had to answer, yes, I do. And I remember him shaking his head, and that was the end of the conversation. And so I'm standing there, and just a moment ago, I was comfortable fishing. And they go back in the house, and they visit with her, say just a few words. Then they walk back out, walk past me, and don't say a word. They get in their car, and they drive off. And then later I find out that in the few words they had with her, they said, oh yeah, don't worry about him. He'll be okay. Now, that was a lot of years ago, but I still remember that clearly. And when I read this passage, that came flooding back to my mind. Man, I had one of those. And it went down just about the same way. And it just flooded my mind. Now, I would be remiss if I said that from that moment forth, I was a rocket ship for Jesus. And never once did I stray off that dotted line. But guess what? That's not true. It happened again and again. But I never once had a Sam come up to me and tell me and have a conversation with me like Jesus did with Peter. It just melted my heart when I read this passage in it. And that's what the Spirit does. It gets in there and tells us things we need to know in the way we need to know it. Okay, it touches you. And the story comes out and just grabs you. And that's the recipe that Jesus laid out in his word for us to read thousands of years later on how to gently restore someone. And it's a very powerful story. I like the fact that Randy mentioned that for him, this is one of the most valuable stories in the whole book of John. And I have to admit that I've read this enough times that the significance just didn't always grab me. But this time, when I was preparing, that came out of the cobwebs and just covered me up. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to finish the story. Another way the Spirit helped me, because I was heartbroken because he didn't go to church. We would go to the lake. Mom and Dad had a lake house. There was a couple across the street that got us into the church way before that. And he was an elder in the Church of Christ. We were all at the lake, okay? We were going to the lake church, and he walked up to me. I'm with my girls and Mom and Dad, and he says, Joey, does Jim not go to church anymore? And that was, I almost can't say that without crying. But he goes, you don't worry about it. He goes, he's going to come back. And that, I can't tell you how much that calmed me. And I didn't worry about it after that. I prayed for it, but I didn't fret and cry and worry. Anyway, that was the Holy Spirit working through him. You remember that, right?
Yeah, I remember that one.
I think sometimes we have that come to Jesus moment in our life, when in reality, it's Jesus coming to you, not us going to him.
Correct.
I think, and that's what this particular chapter means to me, is that Jesus came to Peter where he was, not asking Peter to, well, you come over here if you want to know what's going on. You have to come to the building to get that instruction. No. Go to them and meet them where they are. At the lake. I'll meet you at the lake. It's a good way to do it. And that's exactly what he did.
Absolutely.
And he took breakfast. Cool.
Right.
So,
Be honest with yourself. You know that there's an issue with someone, and either you've been asked or you've been goaded, you've been pushed. Be really honest here, that you need to go restore them, talk to them. What's the very first thing that comes to your mind? Oh no, me? I can't do that. I don't want to do that. I will just mess it up, right? I mean, this is not a first nature for us, if we're honest, okay? Not something we would look forward to. But Jesus gives us the most simple recipe, one that's easy to follow, relatively, for probably a foolproof way of doing that. And it's just simply, do you love Jesus? Because really, if the answer is no, then you don't have a foundation. Or if you don't love Jesus, can you get back to loving Jesus? Can you see that far? Can you stretch that far? Okay? Do you love Jesus enough to continue with this conversation? It's not about me. You're not trying to please me. It's about you and Jesus. Well, if you do love Jesus, then feed my sheep. So if I say to you, feed my sheep, what does that mean to you? It'll have a meaning, and for each person, it's likely to be different. Eric.
You have situations that lots of bad things happen to you. And you get to the point to ask Jesus, do you love me?
Mm-hmm.
Why this is happening to me?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, one of the things that Randy mentions is part of that is designed to take your eyes off of yourself. And that's what happens. We get wrapped up in ourselves, and we get the shell around us that you can't hardly break through. Max Lucado had a class that I was in once, and he had a picture of a huge clamshell that you could get in, and it would close up behind you, and it was inches thick. And that's what we do. We carry this clamshell. We have it stored somewhere. And when the time's right, we get it out, we get in there, and boom, we slam that thing shut, right? And everything just bounces off the shell of it. But the Spirit is in there with you, okay? And Jesus can penetrate that clamshell, and does, and He can talk to your heart. But if anything from this lesson and from this class, this is about building our faith, strengthening our walk. And remember, faith is not a noun, faith is a verb. We faith. Okay? We faith. We increase our faith. We increase our faith by using the tools that God has given us, by realigning with Jesus. We talked last week about being that dotted line from us straight to Jesus. We're not looking off to the sides, because that's where we get all confused, and that's where our shell is parked over there somewhere. Okay? Don't look at the shell. Look at the dotted line between you and Jesus. Okay? Look at God's glory at the end. Our job, our realignment, is to glorify God by reflecting Jesus. That's our job. It doesn't have to be difficult to say what your job is. It's not a 2-page resume, which is now, I think, probably a thing of the past. It's got to be 2 paragraphs now. But you get the point. And this is a beautiful, beautiful story of Jesus meeting somebody where they were, picking them up, realigning them for the task ahead, and then launching. So, for the last couple minutes of class, what happened after this? Historical terms. Anybody?
Peter became the leading for a time there in Jerusalem, right? And he performed some miracles, you know.
Absolutely, he was a superstar. Okay, he took that realignment and took it to heart. And God equipped him with the task at hand, and he went off and did that task. And he paid the price for that task. And he knew he would pay the price because the scriptures just said that at some point somebody will get you up and dress you for a place you do not want to go. And so the historical records say that that was a cross for him too. And what happened to the other disciples? Once they launched and they started spreading the word, and by the way, they couldn't stop the word once they started the spreading of it. And it reverberated across the world. They met ugly ends as well. But in the end, each one of those was a glorification for God. So what's our job? Think about that this next week. What is your job? And how do we exercise that faith muscle? That's what you want to go away and think about. Thank you for being here and going through this session. It's been an eye-opener. Randy is very good about taking details out and making them anew and thinking about them in a different manner. And so I thank you. So have a blessed week.